Hello, everybody. Well, Jonathan, I'm just going to give you the ability to speak, which would be useful to you.
Yes.
All right, good. You're here. And I can promote you to co-host, which will give you the ability to share your slides, etc. So you're now a co-host as well, in case you want to do that. It's good to see you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, likewise. And a little bit better condition than last week.
Yes, exactly. How are you doing?
Yeah, okay, otherwise. Yeah, I'll fine. I think, yeah, if everyone had a little bit of a scare for the first day, then it's kind of strangely gone back to normal. But then we're between one crisis and another crisis with the pandemic, so I guess people are kind of used to it. But
Yeah.
Otherwise, okay.
Yeah, frightening. Yeah, I was thinking about you. It was a terrible event. Yeah, absolutely dreadful.
Yeah.
So I'll just people are still coming in, but I might. We're at 4 o'clock now, according to my watch. So I might start introducing you, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So, and excuse me if I don't pronounce is it Greig? Is that right? Am I pronouncing?
It's Greg, just like the first name.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. I wasn't sure, so yeah, good. I'm glad I checked. Well, everyone is very welcome to this final public lecture in the UCD Newman Center for the Study of Religions public lecture series. I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Jonathan Greig speaking today. He's a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and also, perhaps more importantly from our perspective, a member of the Neoplat ERC-funded project, which is based in the School of Philosophy and led by Dragos Kama, a member of our school. And so we're absolutely delighted to have someone from the project speaking. And this session is being recorded, and after the talk we'll have time for a Q&A. So thank you very much, Jonathan. You can take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just set up my slide here. I just use the slides just for quotes. Most of it will just be me reading. Maybe I should first share the screen. Let's see. Okay, just to be a second here. You have to go through privacy settings. Mac thinks ahead for you. Okay, actually it says I have to quit and open it again. So just give me a quick few seconds.
Yeah, of course, take your time. An eerie silence. The annoying thing about this webinar format is that no one can speak unless I give them permission. I don't like having this kind of control. So if you're just joining us, Dr. Greig is just logging in and out of his system so that he can share his screen. So he'll be along very shortly. And thank you very much for coming. I hope he comes back. Oh, yes, he's here. Good. I had a message. So I'm going to, there we go, promote him to the panel and then make him a co-host, and he should reappear. Yep, you're back, Jonathan.
Okay, yes, well, so hopefully you see the slide now.
Oh no! Well, I can't. Hold on, just a second. Can other people see the slides? I'm afraid I can't. I just see your name against a black background at the moment.
Uh, oh wait, so I forgot to try this now.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, and there's a launch meeting dialog box that you need to close out. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, perfect then. Okay.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Yeah, my apologies. Okay, yeah, so let me just, just briefly state, I mentioned, this, most of my normal work is, I usually work on Neoplatonic metaphysics, but I've long had an interest with David Foster Wallace. It's someone I've been trying to read for the last 9 years. So this has been a really nice opportunity to kind of do a little bit of sharing between Wallace and Plato. That's of course also main interest. So let me just begin. So our current moment in Western society has not been a particularly bright one, especially as regards the unity of society, where divisions have grown more apparent between different groups, political groups, identities, and individuals. This has given many thinkers pause to reflect on our situation. How much this is recent or the result of years or centuries of presuppositions about the nature of individualism as those who have come to hold it now, in general the question or problem of modernity and liberal secularity. Amidst a number of questions and difficulties one may raise in this context, one specific question is that of unity. Is there still any possibility to realize unity in an increasingly fragmented society as we find it now today? And is there any role that religion, broadly construed, can or should play in this? With these two questions in mind, I would like to consider for today's talk the American author David Foster Wallace from 10 to 20 years ago, and the ancient Greek philosopher Plato from 2,400 years ago. Although the pairing might seem odd if anachronistic, there are certain crucial points on which both agree in broad outline, and which may be helpful for us in our context. In particular, their thoughts on the nature of the person and on the possibility for the unity of all people in society ultimately dovetail with their conception of religion as an essential unifier, which links the person with the greater whole and hence makes true empathy with others and the world ultimately possible. One of the things I want to argue in my talk is that Plato and Wallace face surprisingly similar problems despite radically different chronologies and contexts. Plato, in the guise of his main dialogue figures like Socrates in the Timaeus or the Athenian stranger in the Laws, is responding to a state of decline, if existential morass, in Athens. Wallace, in turn, faces perhaps an even greater existential morass, if crisis of identity and stability, in modern American society, which is itself emblematic of Western individualism. Both figures thus face deeply problematic societies within their respective times, which motivate their reflections on the self and the possibility for the self's well-being in relation to others in the greater world. Though both write in sharply different ways, one is a philosopher and dialogist, the other is a modern prose-style novelist. The parallel in their striking analyses, especially in the role of religion for society and the self, is striking, and hence one main reason for me in looking at the two for my talk today. I will begin with Plato and look at his notion of religion and society through his discussion of the ideal city and the laws, where we find his discussion of religion. In the second part, I will look at Wallace's discussion of religion from works like his novel Infinite Jest and other nonfiction work in the context of the individual self's need for union with another that does not result in the self's further engagements. For Wallace, only religion, broadly conceived, can fulfill this role. At the end, I will then discuss in what ways Plato and Wallace can be considered together on the subjects of religion and society, factoring in the widely different scopes and projects of their discussions. So first, beginning with Plato on religion and society. We should first put Plato's views in context, especially in the late dialogues like the Laws, Book 10, where his notion of religion is spelled out. Here I will follow Dominic Omar's analysis in his 2017 book, where he connects Plato's views on political order and religion to his conception of the cosmos. In showing this link, Omar highlights Plato's use of multiple contextual cues, For example, the importance of the dialogue form, contemporary cultural and religious elements, and so on, important to understand Plato's overarching cosmology and consequently his views on religion. We see this in Plato's first few introductory pages of the Timaeus, which bears on our topic. Though the dialogue opens contemporaneously with its main characters, Socrates, Critias, and Timaeus, Critias recites the story of the founding of Athens and its war with the legendary Atlantis, a time long past and forgotten to the contemporary listeners in the dialogue. In the story, early Athens is said to be virtuous and heroic in its victory over Atlantis, which is said to be morally corrupt in seeking purely after power rather than truth or reason. What is noteworthy for us is how Plato ultimately frames the story as distantly in the past to the time of the dialogue's characters. One also sees this when the dialogue turns next to Timaeus, the character Timaeus, when he retells the ancient story of the cosmos beginning, at a similar remove from the dialogue characters as the story of Athens beginning. The effect of this distancing is that we are told of a state of affairs not as they are exactly now, either the now of the dialogue's time, or the now of Plato's time, or furthermore, our now as the reader. This does not mean that we, the reader, should critique Plato for being a relativist, but rather we need to see these past events as putting the present in perspective in relation to these sketched out past events. Here I follow Dominic O'Mara's assessment that this technique of consigning to a very distant past debates actually taking place at present has the effect of allowing the reader to take some distance to detach her or himself from the immediate present, opening the debate to new perspectives. In the case of Athens, we are reminded of a past that is no longer present, an Athens which was virtuous that now no longer is, and yet one has a picture of what it looks like then, and a template from which Athens could rise again to fame. At the same time, Athens' beginning from Critias' retelling is conceivably inspired by the story of the cosmos' own beginning, even though this story is beyond any possible human history. Hence, Plato seems to intend these multiple past angles as a way of framing the present perspective and providing a template for the possible future. So from earlier, the story of a virtuous Athens is set against the context of Socrates and Critias' presence, in turn meant to illustrate the possible future that could elapse by dialoguing and engaging with an event in the past that in no way mirrors or matches the present. Matching, in turn, the framing of the past as a likely story equals mythos, at least for Timaeus' story of the cosmos' beginning. This framing is important to consider the nature of the forms or paradigms that Plato discusses in the Timaeus and later dialogues, and it becomes important later on for how Plato frames the ordering of society and religion in this context. For it shows that contrary to what one might expect in other, perhaps stereotypical construals of the forms in Plato, there is not a one-to-one correlation between the form and its instantiation. That is, the cosmos' order that we see in Timaeus' story cannot be an exact copy of the paradigm, according to which the creator or demiurge, from the Greek demiurgos, produces the cosmos. But it is rather a rough approximation, one in which the demiurge works with the constraints of necessity embodied in the preformed state of the elements. We also see this in the demiurge's delegation of the production of lower living beings to subordinate young gods, as Plato calls them. The task of specifying individual details in the general order that the demiurge produces is left to these subordinate entities. This ultimately reflects an openness in the way paradigms are instantiated in lower beings in the Timaeus. And it in turn reflects the way Plato writes the dialogues from the vantage point of the past as a way of allowing for a plurality of interpretations, depending on the context of the reader. Much more could be said about this, but I think this is enough to give a sketch for how we should see Plato's discussion of religion in the context of the paradigm city that he sketches in the Laws. Even the proposals he voices in the current time of the dialogue cannot be realized in exactly the same way. He even admits as much, that is, that the city he describes cannot be realized in Laws 5, but rather they only serve as templates for the different ways those proposals can be realized, even in the reader's, that is, our context. Plato's notion of religion comes out in his discussion of the paradigm city in the Laws, and as we find his conception of religion there, it is interweaved in the order and life of the city. Hence, understanding the different aspects of religion in Plato involves how he sees the order of the city in outline. As he describes the city in the Laws, we find a number of correspondences in the way he describes the cosmos in the Timaeus. So, for example, one point is, in the Timaeus, the cosmos is described as a god, while in the Laws, the land of the city is described as sacred. In the Timaeus, the cosmos is spherically shaped, and in the Laws, the city's land is circular in shape. Both geometrical proportion characterizes both the unity of the cosmos in the Timaeus and the unity of the city in the Laws. And yes, and so on. So here we can see that Plato's paradigm city closely mirrors the structure of the cosmos. And given this, it is noteworthy that Plato in the Laws speaks of the political model for the city as only the second best in unity. So that is, the city, his city, is not the highest or best model. In some ways, this is a contrast to the picture of the city we have in Plato's earlier dialogue, the Republic, where the city there is supposed to mirror the structure of the human soul. By contrast in the Laws, though the city is also an imitation like this Republic city, it is a more dim one, as only the second best. Given this, Plato yet emphasizes that the goal, in contrast to the city's model, is towards what is the best. In other words, though the city cannot be exactly like the perfect order of the cosmos, it still looks to the cosmos as corresponding to its highest goal. In the same way, the demiurge looks to the intelligible paradigm of the living animal, in the words of the Timaeus, as the highest goal for its creation of the cosmos, even while the cosmos's immediate model can only be the second best. Once more, the important takeaway here is a threefold hierarchy that Plato draws between the cosmos and the city. That is, first, paradigm, which is the final goal. Second, the immediate model from which the city's or the cosmos's instantiation is realized. And third, the actual physical instantiation, either of the city or cosmos, which may well differ from place to place. This threefold hierarchy helps to contextualize Plato's discussion of religion in the city. As he describes it in the Laws, the city is distributed into 12 villages, oriented circularly around the city's geographical center, where the Acropolis is, with temples dedicated to the three main gods of Athena, Zeus, and Hestia. Each village, in turn, has temples to the three central gods, and that village's specific god, which, it is noteworthy, Plato does not name the gods of these individual villages, though he does name the city's three central gods, a point I will come back to shortly. At the beginning of Book 8 of the Athenian Stranger establishes religious festivals for each day of the year, while in each month he describes two particular celebrations, one in honor of the 12 gods, in honor of one of the 12 regional gods, and one in honor of one of the gods of each subdivision within that village. In other words, we find that religious festivity is a central key aspect of the life of the city, distributed through physical space and time. Despite the dizzying division of different gods, what is noteworthy here is how Plato attempts to respect the balance between the individual and universal. In other words, respecting the gods individual to a specific place or set of people, which are also connected to the higher essential gods over and above any one or another village within the city. In turn, the religious life of the city's citizens also reflects this division. Religious life anchors the unity of each part of the city from the village to each village's subdivision, in turn to each individual person within each village. It is then an imitation of the physical order of the city, in turn a reflection of the higher levels of the physical cosmos, and in turn the paradigm of the cosmos. Hence, religious life for Plato is both public and is the core trait of community life, not working or making money. Also notable here is that Plato bans the practice of private religion. In other words, the celebration of gods only for that individual from the worship of the community that that individual belongs to. Hence, religious activity is that by which each person in the community is unified with each other and ultimately with the order of the cosmos, while at the same time respecting the individuality of each person's and place's context. Here we might pause and ask why religion has the central context that it has here. So far, we can see how it imitates both the order of the city and by proxy the cosmos. Yet what is it about this imitation that brings about the desired unity of the city? And a fortiori, the unity of the person? And in what respect are we to understand the object or objects of religion? Since we have many gods, and yet an underlying unity behind them. Let me address the first point, namely the function of religion for Plato, before concluding the section on Plato with the second. One of the main features of religion that comes out early on in the laws is its pedagogical character. It is meant to habituate moral education in a way that discursive education cannot. We see this from the beginning of Book 2 in the laws. Education, then, is a matter of correctly disciplined feelings of pleasure and pain. But in the course of a man's life, the effect wears off, and in many respects, it is lost altogether. The gods, however, took pity on the human race, born to suffer as it was, and gave it relief in the form of religious festivals to serve as periods of rest from its labors. They gave us the Muses with Apollo, their leader, and by Dionysus. By having these gods to share their festivals, men were to be set straight again, and thanks to them, we find refreshments in the celebration of these festivals. So we see here that education is meant to show the things we should take pleasure or pain in, corresponding to virtuous activity and its opposite in vice. Yet Plato recognizes that throughout adult life, such education can wear off and become forgotten. Thus, the periodic ritual celebration in the different gods is meant to substitute for this. They are festivals meant to bring pleasure, though not for pleasure's own sake, but for the sake of engendering a virtuous life. In this respect, the kind of activities done in these festivities, should also reflect in some sense the proportionality of the city's divisions. Hence, Plato stresses rhythm and harmony in the music and dancing scene in each festival. Once more, this again reflects the essential role of imitation. The dances and music in religious festivity in turn reflect the order of the city, in turn also reflecting the cosmos. The focus on proportionality, mathematical ratios, and the distribution of unity delegated to the differing levels of multiplicity should then make us wonder about the nature of the type of religion that Plato is considering. In his discussion of the city and its religion, Plato is not terribly interested in the specific gods who overlook the city. He names Athena, Hestia, and Zeus as the three central gods. But when, for instance, he goes on to demonstrate the existence of the gods in Laws Book 10 as persuasion for the city's citizens, he's not interested to show exactly Zeus or the identity of any other gods. Instead, his proof involves showing that the movements of the stars and planets must ultimately go back to self-moved entities that are immaterial and first causes of any motion. Hence, they must be divine. Yet just what or who these divine entities are is not important for the purpose of this persuasion, as more to show simply that there is a paradigm, or plural paradigms, based on which the cosmos finds its order, and therefrom the city and its laws are structured. One also sees this dynamic in Plato's Timaeus, where the demiurge similarly is not identified with any specific god, yet its existence and the necessity for the cosmos structure is still shown as it is. This brings us to one final observation about Plato's framework. What appears to stand out is the importance of logos in his account of religion, what is usually translated as reason, but also means proportion, account, and so on. The linking of religious life and activity to the structure of the city and the cosmos, though implicitly connected to the traditional pantheon of Greek gods, also goes well beyond this. The important link in Plato's conception of religion, along with society, is their relation to their ultimate goal, which is the eternal order of the cosmos. That order is linked ultimately to immaterial principles, whatever identity they may be, which are ultimately expressed en logos. One can see this in Laws 4, where the Athenian stranger concludes, where the ruler of a state is not a god, but a mortal, people have no escape from evils and toil. The lesson is that we should make every effort to imitate the life men are said to have led under Chronos. We should run our public and our private life, our homes and our cities, in obedience to what there is of immortality in us, and calling the dispositions, in the Greek dianome, of reason, law, nomos. This theme of immortality in us, that is, reason or logos, is one Plato often links to the order of the cosmos, and ultimately to the gods as eternal principles. For Plato, this also holds a therapeutic value, as one can see in his character Timaeus' retelling of the cosmos' foundation, where Timaeus' story ends with an explanation of the structure of body and soul in humans, such that one's health ultimately depends on modeling her or himself on the overarching model of the universe. Taking this back to religious practice, the identity of the gods is not important in and of itself. More important, rather, is the priority of logos as the common link between cosmos, city, and individual. On the other hand, the gods' identities do matter for the specific physical realizations of those religious festivities and celebrations. Who or what those gods are becomes the means by which one is integrated with logos, so long as logos is grasped. Hence, we have in Plato a conception of religion which is, in many respects, open-ended. Though he refers to traditional Greek gods such as Zeus and Athena, what he emphasizes is their relation to the broader, overarching context of logos, or reason. Expressed in the cosmos' intelligible paradigm, the cosmos' realized order, and in turn the order of the ideal city under discussion in the laws. These are templates upon templates, but they are oriented around a common ground of unity. Yet that common ground is dynamic and open-ended in its realization. Perhaps this is why it cannot be correct to call Plato's city a theocracy, but neither is it purely a secular state. For Plato emphatically argues that the city and its citizens should orient themselves as children of the cosmos to its order. And in this, Plato also underlines the therapeutic value of this order, and in turn the order of religion and turning oneself towards it. So now turning to David Foster Wallace on religion, and in this case on the self. So now turning to Wallace, we have probably the thematic and chronological equivalent of whiplash from our discussion of Plato, and yet, as we may see, dimly familiar themes in postmodernist garb. In certain ways, Wallace's treatment of religion and society is more inferential than what we have seen in Plato. Yet on the other hand, the two themes are quite strongly the silent center point of much of Wallace's writing, one of my main reasons for focusing on Wallace's work in relation to Plato. So first, to summarize his oeuvre briefly, David Foster Wallace is most well known for his 1,078-page novel, Infinite Jest, published in 1996, as well as two other novels, The Broom of the System from 1987, and his posthumously edited novel, The Pale King from 2011, and a number of short stories and essays. The title of Wallace's Infinite Jest, comically perplexing as it may sound, is taken from a line in Shakespeare's Hamlet, where Hamlet holds up the skull of poor York, referencing him as a fellow of infinite jest. This morbid, sober reminder of finitude in the face of the seeming infinite could well describe Wallace's novel, if not much of Wallace's works. Infinite Jest focuses on a set of characters in a near future-like dystopia set in America between Boston and Arizona, made up of recovering addicts in a halfway house and high school students in a tennis academy. All these figures grapple with the nature of entertainment in America as both a means of escape from isolation and existential loneliness, and simultaneously the cause of such isolation and loneliness. One sees this borne out in the characters' particular contexts. For example, in the character Don Gately, a Demerol addict who is in recovery with an Alcoholics Anonymous group in the halfway house, alongside the character Hal Incandenza, one of the novel's main characters in the tennis academy, who develops an addiction to marijuana in between his relentless pursuit of success in tennis. Wallace perceives this theme throughout his major characters, who all seek to escape existential angst and isolation through different, ultimately destructive means. A pertinent example of this is in one part of the novel, where Wallace describes Hal Incandenza's father, Mario Incandenza, as the author of a movie called, like the novel's title, Infinite Jest, which is so compelling that viewers, so that is a medical attaché, the hostel staff that checks on the attaché, and then anyone else who enters the attaché's room, are each one by one enthralled, transfixed, and unable to stop, ultimately to stop watching the film, finally to their deaths. The inadvertent participants of this film, rather than face their angst, ultimately prefer to entertain and amuse themselves to their deaths, to borrow the phrase of the title of Neil Postman's famous 1985 book, which is, of course, probably one strong theme, of course, in Wallace's work. This points to one common theme throughout Wallace's works, which he refers to, in his own words, as a double bind. That is, being faced with a decision between two alternatives, neither of which is unacceptable. The double bind often describes the situation of facing immense existential loneliness on the one hand, and unacceptable attempts to be rid of that loneliness on the other. An example of this is in Hal and Cadenza's musing about a common consciousness of this existential state in growing up. To quote here, "We enter a spiritual puberty where we snap to the fact that the great transcendent horror is loneliness, excluded engagement in the self. Once we've hit this age, we will now give or take anything, wear any mask to fit, be part of, not be alone, we young." In a footnote on this passage, Wallace gives a sharper characterization of the state. How else to explain the curious feeling that goes around feeling like he misses somebody he's never even met? Hence, we see in Hal, and indeed many other characters, the different attempts to plug the hole of loneliness, as Hal describes, give or take anything, wear any mask to fit, be part of. And yet these attempts often spiral into ever deeper self-destructive moments of loneliness. One reflected in the different addictive cycles, attempts at success, and so on. As Wallace describes in another character elsewhere, any such attempt bends back in on the self, makes you narrow. In other words, the attempt to go outside the pain of oneself by reaching out only entraps one further within the self, the kind of narrowing at work. This dynamic that we see on an individual level with these different characters exemplifies a very common feature of American life. As Wallace maintains elsewhere in Infinite Jest, American experience seems to suggest that people are virtually unlimited in their need to give themselves away on various levels. That is, in this context, either to recreational substances, drugs, or also the pursuit of success. That is, for example, tennis playing, as here with Hal and Cadenza. Such giving away is tied to Wallace's insipid observation about American life, and perhaps most modern Western life in general, that the state is not a team or a code but a sloppy intersection of desires and fears, where the only public consensus a boy must surrender to is the acknowledged primacy of straight line pursuing this flat and short-sighted idea of personal happiness, the happy pleasure of the person alone, yes? Hence, it is here in a society that prizes individual freedoms to do as one pleases that this notion of giving oneself away is found in its infinitude. Wallace often uses the phrase giving oneself over or away to indicate a commitment or orientation of one's whole self around any given object, a phrase he borrows from Alcoholics Anonymous in its literature. While this might refer to, say, alcohol, or in Hal's case, marijuana, or any stereotypical object of addiction, Wallace applies this notion to a much broader range of things, such as success, self-image, sexual lure, and so on. What Wallace highlights is not the objects per se that cause the downfall and suffering of the characters, and of many people in general, but rather the motivating drive behind all characters in giving themselves over, especially in that drive's infinite nature. In his well-known 2005 commencement speech at Kenyon College in the US, it's also titled "This is Water," Wallace characterizes this giving over as a kind of worship which everyone engages in. As he famously states, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as worshiping. Everyone worships. What Wallace means here is that everyone orients their life around some given object, not merely in an explicit way, say in a religious context, but rather implicitly. Wallace connects this with what he calls the default setting, that is, the experience of most people, where the perception and story of the world and reality centers around the self. In other words, the default, if unconscious narrative one has in everyday life. That the stories of other people, whatever and however they are, take a backseat to your own narrative as you go through the world. So, for example, you could be driving in a traffic and someone cuts you off in a giant Hummer, a very typical American problem. And you might think the Hummer driver is thinking only for himself and for the sheer insensitivity and sport of cutting you off, which certainly this may be a natural thought. Yet, as Wallace suggests, there could be other stories going on than your natural default one. For instance, the driver might be rushing his small child to the hospital emergency room, in which case you were the one in the driver's way and not yourself. This story may or may not be true, but the larger point Wallace drives here is the question of awareness. Can one step outside one's own narrative, revolving around the self, to consider the other possible stories of others around oneself? The issue of awareness, as we will see shortly, is a crucial aspect of Wallace's approach to religion. But for now, this should help illustrate Wallace's default setting, how Wallace's default setting is connected to the notion of worship. For as Wallace extrapolates from this previous scenario, much of our general way of life is oriented around worshiping something, oftentimes in this default sets above. What Wallace argues is that everybody worships in precisely the same sense that everyone gives themselves over to something, and that despite this default setting most have, one has a choice of what to worship. And I just realized I might have skipped ahead a slide, so I apologize for any confusion earlier. So, as he goes on to elaborate, so I'm quoting from the slide here, the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC, of course, Jesus Christ, or Allah, or Yahweh, or the Wiccan Mother Goddess, or the Four Noble Truths, or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. Worship your body and beauty and sexual lure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story, and so on. What Wallace implicitly highlights here is that the forms of worship that do not involve the spiritual type thing are all finite. If one's object of worship in the attempt for satisfaction is money or power, for instance, eventually one realizes the inherent finitude of that object and the resulting suffering and pain it brings. We can relate this again to the theme of the double bind from earlier. The self in the state of isolation and loneliness attempts to find something which can free it. Hence it attempts to worship or give itself away to something. Yet the object it ultimately chooses, like Hal's substance abuse or the other tennis player's addictive pursuit of glory and success, further entrenches the self. This latter case seems to be precisely what Wallace points to in his speech with the finite objects of worship that eat you alive, in his words. As he says afterwards, the problem with these specific objects is not that they're all evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious, they are default settings, they're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value, without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. Wallace's observation here helps throw into relief his earlier points on the role of attention as a precondition for any possible conscious choice of what to worship, in his words. In other words, how one orients one's life. Here, the lack of attention would then be the first, if unconscious, sin, in a sense, that leads to the entrapment of the self. And in this sense, Wallace suggests that attention can be the start toward transcending the entrapment of the double bind of the self. I think now we have the background and enough context to understand Wallace's view of the problem of the self in a modern context and how religion can address this. For as it seems clear now, Wallace sees ritual, that is, in his words, worship, as a given fact of people's lives, even if there is no intention or conscious thoughts in this, especially. Where things go wrong is when these rituals end up only reinforcing the self and instigating the vicious cycle between isolation and giving oneself over to things that only perpetuates the isolation. In this dynamic, everyone desires a connection to something in the way that implies transcending the self, and the lack of this connection is what leads to the state of existential isolation and loneliness. It is also here that we see Wallace's attempted solution to this, and here in his conception of religion, as that by which true connection is possible. As in the earlier scenario with the Hummer, when we try to set aside our default setting and reframe the stories of other people into our own, we may then transcend the self and find connection. The key aspect to this from earlier is attention, where the perception of other options is the doorway to this freedom. As Wallace considers, it will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell type situation as not only meaningful but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things, deep down. Here, Wallace qualifies that even if this mysticism is not actually the case, it is still in the sheer perception of possibilities like this, outside one's own default, that the first step outside the self is already realized. This is what Robert Bolger, in a recent article on Wallace's pragmatic spirituality, calls the religious stance, partly borrowing from the character of Father Zosima in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, where, to quote Zosima, "If you love everything, you'll perceive the divine mystery in things." Following Bolger's take, this means first, not just acknowledging the fact of the world in its current existence, but more importantly, secondly, actively choosing to see the world in a certain way, like Zosima's active love, by which we perceive the divine. We can see this also in Wallace's character, Don Gately, the recovering halfway house addict, when he tries relating to his AA group meeting the difficulty of finding a God of his own understanding, a crucial aspect of the group program's 12-step process. Though on the one hand, he follows AA's advice of morning and evening prayers for help to his higher power. Whether he believes he's talking to anything buddy or not, he somehow gets through that day clean. As Wallace continues, when Gately tries to go beyond the very basic role, the rote automatic get me through the day, please stuff, when he kneels at other times and prays or meditates or tries to choose a big picture spiritual understanding of a God as he can understand him, he feels nothing. Not nothing, but emphatically nothing, capital N. Though Gately tries to find something he can grasp and truly comprehend, which is outside or beyond himself, the irony is that Gately cannot see what is already in front of him at that exact moment. In the activity of praying itself, in the presence of that nothing, he already experiences the effect of his God concept, whatever it is, in staying clean. Thus, Wallace's point about awareness fits here. Gately searches for something outside himself which he already possesses now, though not yet being consciously aware of that present moment. Here we can summarize Wallace's view of religion. Wallace sees that there is a real problem in American culture which cannot address the reality of existential isolation and loneliness. It is plagued by people seeking to fill the hole with various pursuits, which only entrench one further in the self. The possibility for escape, for true connection to others and unity, can only come about in conscious selflessness. This means first setting aside one's own narrative for other possible narratives, both of others' lives outside oneself and of one's own place in the world, outside his or her default narrative. In doing so, consciously anchoring one's life around what Wallace calls a spiritual type entity, in other words, something truly infinite and outside the self, whether that is God or an infinite entity, can be the only means by which the self is freed, neither annihilated in self-destructive pursuits nor left isolated, but in union with others in the world and thus with the divine. For Wallace, this is something to be realized in each present moment, in any kind of context or time. As he emphasizes in his speech, his position has much less to do with morality or religion per se, in his words, or as he phrases it, big picture questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. So to conclude, and in comparing David Foster Wallace with Plato, if we look at the 4th century BC Plato and the 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century David Foster Wallace and compare them, the differences at first could not be more striking. Plato discusses religion in the broader context of organizing his ideal city, itself a reflection of the cosmos as its paradigm, and the cosmos in turn a reflection of the intelligible paradigm itself. We have nothing like this in Wallace. The discussion of religion for Wallace begins at the level of the individual, rather than from the broader level of society or city, as in Plato. Wallace works within a modern context that no longer cedes the possibility of a unified cosmos, in the way Plato envisions it, and hence no unified vision of reality, whether religious, scientific, or philosophical. One could argue that Wallace is only concerned with religion as a purely individual phenomenon, apart from a conception of religion as the glue of society, at least in the way that Plato discusses religion from what we saw earlier. While raising these caveats to signpost the limitations of analyzing Plato and Wallace together, I think there are still grounds to make the comparison under certain qualified respects. First, we should consider the goal of religion in both figures. For Plato, it is the means of uniting the citizens of the city to that power which orders and unites both the cosmos and proportionally the city, in other words, reason or logos. As we concluded earlier, the identity of the gods for Plato is not as important as their function in bringing unity through logos. On this conception, logos for Plato is the power of unity beyond any individual part or citizen by which unity is realized in all and through all. For Wallace, the goal of religion is to make possible the individual self's freedom from existential loneliness by uniting it with something truly outside the self. In other words, infinite, whatever that is. In doing so, true selflessness and communion with other selves becomes possible. Wallace's conception here can be correlated back to Plato's conception of the gods, whatever their identity is, as the means by which the disparate parts and citizens of the city are united together. It is noteworthy that Plato and Wallace are not concerned with the identity of the gods or God or spiritual type entity, but rather with their nature as universal, beyond any particular or self, and as able to provide unity. Another point of comparison is the role of religion in the present moment, here and now. In Plato, religious activity is distributed through each time and place. It is the central activity of the city, practiced at each moment. Wallace similarly emphasizes the importance of the present now in religious activity, or rather specifically in practicing attention and awareness at each moment, which Wallace also connects with religious activity. As we saw with Wallace, the importance and immediacy of perception is essential in lifting one outside the self, already being on the way to or at the goal of union. Similarly, in Plato, we see the sense countenance, at least loosely, in the way he also emphasizes, for instance, how the demiurge looks at the paradigm in ordering the cosmos, and in the same way how the parts of the city look toward the center, and thus look toward the central three gods, and find their orientation and formation. Hence, both Plato and Wallace emphasize the essential aspect of perception at each present moment, which is another essential aspect of religion for both. Finally, although they seem to come at this from two very different angles, both Plato and Wallace see religious activity, again, whatever form that takes, as the main if sole means for substantive unity in society. Though there isn't the distinct language of the self in Plato like we find in Wallace, perhaps the consequence of the language of the self in modern Western society, as thoroughly elucidated by those like Charles Taylor, there is still roughly the same idea at work. Plato sees religious activity as inherently public and not private when he bans private religion in a city. Plato would then agree with Wallace that religious activity is supposed to bring one outside the self and join with others in real communion. There may be other points of comparison, but I think we see enough here in broad outline of the connection between the two figures in their view of religion and its relation to individuals in society. If anything, Wallace's view gives us a more immediate, relatable way of grasping the thesis he shares with Plato on religion in the points I've just mentioned, inasmuch as he writes for our culture and perhaps prophetically grasps the state of division in much of Western society. As Wallace himself said in a 2006 interview shortly before his untimely death, he sees himself with contemporary authors who use, in his words, postmodern techniques to discuss and represent very old traditional human verities that have to do with spirituality and emotional community, and ideas that the avant-garde would consider very old-fashioned. In this sense, Wallace very much saw himself as a modern. He was never able to join an organized religion, such as the Catholic Church, which he attempted to join multiple times throughout his life. And yet he saw the value of it, as it comes out in much of his writing. He often called Alcoholics Anonymous his church, to the degree it followed what he held about the nature of religious activity. Perhaps in this way, Wallace gives us a postmodern mirror back to aspects of Plato, which may illuminate our situation as moderns, being aware of real, unavoidable problems pervading our way of life, and some possible ways to address this. And thank you very much for your patience in listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Thank you. So I'll open the floor now to questions. You have a choice in this format. You can either raise your hand by clicking on participants at the bottom of the screen and hitting the raise hand icon, or if you for some reason you'd rather simply type your question, you can type it into the chat or the Q&A functions at the bottom of the screen. So I'll look out for raised hands now. If anyone has any questions. And we have Maeve Cook. Thanks, Maeve. I'll let you talk now. There you go. Maeve, you're muted right now, but if you unmute, you should be able to ask a question.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your lecture. I'm just really kicking things off here with a problem of understanding on my part. And before I have any more substantive questions to formulate, I just wanted to, something I'm not entirely clear about. And that is in the case of Foster Wallace, why, it's just a level of comprehension, why the problems of enthrallment or entrapment in finitude, I can see why Wallace thinks that we have to give ourselves over to something outside ourselves. But I don't see why it has to be something non-religious. So the examples that you gave are and I seem to recall this from the many years ago when I got halfway through Infinite Jest, are all ones that involve competition of some sort, or even tennis playing is a competitive sport. But what about, swimming in the sea, or running non-competitively, or simply even loving another person? Why aren't these pursuits of something outside themselves that are potentially infinite?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he would probably say it's something to do with perspective here in a way. I think my sense is he's rather open-ended about what that is. I'm not quite sure if he would go all the way with something like Alcoholics Anonymous, but they more or less have the similar idea that basically the concept of God as one understands him, that basically could be as being as simple as something like the group itself, or as nature or laws of physics, perhaps, or the like. I think his bigger point, at least, is to whatever degree these different activities have a kind of finitude as far as something that you can grasp and something that or as something as you want to grasp for yourself. And I think it's insofar as, I think that's maybe where the finite point kind of comes in, that so long as it's something you can delimit and determine for yourself, there's already kind of the danger of the self kind of grasping that as it can manipulate for itself, rather than being at the mercy of something it can't delimit in some sense. So I think the examples you draw, it's possible they could also fall in that religious domain. I think, yeah, I guess it just depends on how much you can sort of go for the infinite angle there. So yeah, in all honesty, I'm also trying to kind of better define or understand that in Wallace as well. So yeah, I think that there may be something to that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Maeve. I might interject with a question of my own, if that's okay. So I really enjoyed the talk. I was thinking a similar-ish question to Maeve's, really what you think about this. I don't know Plato's well as you do, of course, but I associate Plato with the sort of broad view, probably quite simplistic view, that real value lies in communion with the forms, or the the immutable parts of reality, rather than the mutable and material parts of reality. And of course, that's something one finds in many religions as well, and is not too dissimilar from the idea that, in some sense, communion with the infinite is preferable to communion with the finite, for the sorts of reasons you mentioned, and that you find in David Foster Wallace. Then I wonder, and then you mentioned, and I thought it was very interesting, the point about having coming to realize that there's a narrative around one's relationships with other people that doesn't have oneself at the center, and that is also a good effect of the kinds of practices that we might label as religious, that are kind of similarly recommended by Plato and Foster Wallace. But then I wondered, and then I was thinking about the gospel, and love for others and so on, and the sort of injunction to love others as one loves oneself, which is again sort of similar kind of thought. And then I worried slightly that there's a kind of a paradox, or there's a kind of tension at the very least, and this has always struck me about religious thought anyway, it's probably very obvious, between love for others and concern for others in their finitude and their in their often base desires like our own, and their mistakes and so on, and the kind of forgiveness that and communion with the infinite, which seems to take us away from other people in a sense. So I was wondering if either of the two interesting thinkers you've mentioned have anything to say to that sort of tension. And it's a tension I find it very hard to resolve in general, so I'm not expecting any sort of, but I just, that struck me as something in the talk that.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's another angle I've not quite thought of. I think that's actually been sort of in the background. I think another tension I could see too is, to what degree, and there's a sort of tension between, not to go off track here, but he also just gets into this tension with, to try to seek out something beyond oneself, to be entirely selfless. It's, on the other hand, satisfying something which still goes back on the self. So in what way is there, there's a sort of perennial tension between agape, it's a pure selfless love, and then eros, erotic love, which is self-gratifying. It can be self-gratifying, but it could also be, there is still this kind of tension there. To this other one with, to love and unite with something infinite, and to what degree that could be mutually exclusive, or is that mutually exclusive with just loving another, loving others? Yeah, I think it's something that's hinted in the stuff I've read. Maybe he talks about this more explicitly, but I get the sense that he thinks just only to love one other or some others is already the kind of danger of just a limited sort of perspective, rather than in having a constantly open, broad perspective in a way that kind of mirrors the infinite nature of however you orient your life. So he doesn't exactly, Wallace doesn't make this exactly explicit, but I get the sense he would see that one's attempting to unite with God, that's kind of equated with this sort of open-ended perception, or this sort of open-ended attention and awareness of others around you, and that doesn't have any kind of limitation. You're always willing and open to see and to care for others beyond yourself. So, and that I think I also would take to, generally more or less with Plato's point as well, that basically uniting with these different gods, they're basically all united in logos. It's sort of loosely there, and it's more developed in someone like Proclus, who thinks that you have basically this one entity, the principle, the one itself, but then that's realized across many different particular ones or entities. I think that's basically going on in Plato also. So if you're oriented towards one god or one particular, that's always linked to all the others at the end of the day. So in a sense, the infinite kind of implies all these different finite possibilities in itself, but in a unlimited way. So yeah, this kind of a very rough outline, I think, of an answer there, and I think it's yeah, trying to cash that out. Of course, that's always that's always an interesting problem. But I think hopefully that gets in some direction towards what you're wondering.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, thank you. That's really great. Thanks very much. Any other questions? I'm looking out for little blue hands. Not that people actually have little blue hands, of course. I don't see any other questions popping up right now. No, so I'm not seeing any other further questions. And I suppose we've had probably a good hour and a bit. So I'll leave it there in that case to thank you very much, Jonathan, for your book. And thank you for doing it under these trying circumstances. I was sorry about last week, of course, and in general, sorry that we can't meet and all sit together in a room and have a proper discussion. But hopefully that'll come soon.
It's been a pleasure, at least.
Yeah, it's been you too. It's good to sort of virtually meet you, and no doubt we'll meet again in the future. So thanks very much for your talk, and thanks to everyone for coming along.
Yes, thank you very much.